Welcome to the Chief Future Officer podcast. I am Indus Khaitan, your host. Joining me today is Taylor Otstot. Taylor is the Vice President of Finance at Dashlane. Dashlane is an award-winning password manager. Taylor, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
I want to kick off by mentioning your blog post. I was reading about this wonderful little post that you wrote, No More Dr. No. And I was like, oh, this is quite funny. How did you get this moniker? What's the story behind this?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's exclusive to me, I hope. But I think as finance professionals, we often get called something like that, right? CF No, Office of No. I just so happen to get the James Bond version. But what happened is what I think happens so often is in our responsibility or in our drive to keep the business in line or to deliver our outcomes, we start to go too far into the almost like police state mode. And it becomes a lot of no, you can't do that, you can't do this. Like just do the things that we're supposed to be doing, and it really doesn't work ever. I don't know why we do it. It feels intuitive that it should work, but it doesn't. And so what happened for me is I was supporting our customer care team over at GoDaddy, which at the time was a few thousand people sized organization of really passionate folks that want to do right by our customers, and they want the investments to be able to go do that, and they want the ability to experiment. And as so often happens, you don't always have all of the funds to do all of the things. We have more good ideas than we have resources to supply them. And my approach was to be like, no, you can't do that. I'm sorry. And I got this moniker, and I was like, okay, I don't particularly like it because in my personal life, I'm not this negative Nancy type. And so I was trying to figure out, okay, how do I turn this around? And I was introduced to this idea of yes and from improv, where when improv actors are working together on a scene, the idea is that you build upon whatever the other person has improvised. So rather than me saying, hey, boy, you really have a nice cowboy hat, and then you go, I'm not wearing a cowboy hat. It just kills the scene. But if you say, yeah, thanks, and I happen to notice that you're wearing rain boots, like we can keep the conversation going. And so using this concept of yes and kind of brought me to this idea of, all right, first start by seeing the good in what folks are trying to propose and then build upon it. And so the answer may be, yeah, that's a really great idea. And we currently don't have the funding to do more than what we're already strapped to do. So our options then become, do we take something away to go fund this, or do we put this on the back burner? And it not only helps build the collaborative environment that you see on an improv stage, but it also kind of helps put the operators back in the driver's seat, which is where they should be. Ultimately, like we shouldn't be making all the decisions for them. But we kind of have to delegate the power of, we're here to help make sure that we stay in line with whatever the guardrails are that we're set up, but you're still driving the car. And so let's just collectively make sure that we're staying on the road and getting to where we want to go.
Interesting. And which year was that?
Oh, gosh. So I think that was probably about 7 years ago. So I was probably a year or two into my tenure at GoDaddy. I was there for 8 years. So quite honestly, there's a lot of years that bled together, especially because COVID was the last 2 to 3. And so time's a little bit, it's tough to pinpoint exactly when it happened, but it was earlier in my career. And realized that, boy, that was going to hold me back from excelling and doing the things that I wanted to do. Because quite frankly, once you start getting that Dr. No moniker, nobody wants to talk to you anymore. Like they just look for ways to avoid interacting with you. And it's hard to be a partner to someone if no one wants you in the room.
And how did you clean that up?
Yeah, so part of it was just, I had a rule for myself is that I was never going to say the word no. And it was really hard to be like, I'm not going to say that, but it's going to be hard over time for folks to say that I am Dr. No if I'm literally not saying the word. And I really just started to expel upon this concept of yes and this concept of seeing the good, which is like, what are the things that are going, like, what's a valuable insight that's coming into this idea, embellishing upon it to make sure that folks understood that I was on their side, and then turning it around and saying, then how do we actually go and execute upon this? And like any trust exercise, it just took time of building it up and constantly making folks feel like I'm there to be on your side. But part of being on your side is not necessarily giving you what you want, but helping you get what you need. And what we all collectively need is deliver on our commitments, because you consistently don't deliver any commitments, you're probably not going to have that job.
I so much love that, instead of, and we do this in our daily lives as well, right? Because we are in the habit of saying no to many things, the asks from us, versus flipping it to yes and continuing the conversation. So was it like a sudden moment for you? Like, you yesterday you were no, and Monday morning you were yes and, or was it like a gradual transition?
I would say gradual with regression, right? Like sometimes you fall back into old habit. It's a habit that you built up over time. Especially, I grew up in audit to start with, and like audit, you very well can be like, no, you really cannot do that. GAAP says that's not something that you're allowed to do. Um, so it is hard, and so I think one of the biggest slipbacks that I had is really not leaning into the idea of making folks feel like their ideas were valued. I had a moment, probably a year or two after that point, where my partners were really frustrated with me because as they told my boss, Taylor seems to value his ideas more than ours. And like my initial reaction when I heard that was like, well, yeah, because my ideas are really good. And then I went, well, okay, that's not helpful or productive thinking. And I was like, oh, you know what? In my head, I'm thinking about I've looked at it from every angle and I know what's good and what's bad about it. But when the ideas come to me, I start with what's bad. And so then it's really hard to get past that point. And so another really great framework that I kind of alluded to earlier is see the good. So if you're familiar with any kind of recent horror movies, Jason Blum, who's a producer of horror films, had talked about in this one interview about why his production studio was so successful. And what he said is that there's this mantra, this habit within Hollywood of scripts come across your desk, and the first thing you look for is the things that you would criticize, like, oh, this isn't going to work because of X, Y, and Z. And the approach that he took was say, what is the really good part about this that I really like? And then he would start to build constraints around that. And one of the big constraints would be like budget. Unlike a lot of other studios, they were never allowed to go over budget. The director would have free will to do kind of whatever they want to do within the confines of the budget, but that's all that you got. And by leaning into these things of, I'm going to find what's good in this script, I'm going to enable these folks to do it under a constrained environment and see what happens. He was able to get a lot of successes off of really low or inexpensive films. And so I kind of started taking that approach of saying, okay, before I respond, I'm going to step back. I'm going to think about, right, what's the good in this idea? And sometimes I have to think really hard because sometimes the ideas are a little bit abstract or a little bit of a stretch. But if I start with that, then it's a lot easier to talk to that person about why that idea is good. And sometimes we can agree upon the intent of the idea is really good, but maybe the execution wouldn't be. It would be too difficult because we don't have the budget, we don't have the data to prove out if it's working or the resources, whatever those things are. But if we say, hey, like the core crux of what you're trying to get to is actually a really great idea, let's talk about that. That's where I can start to build that collaborative partner where folks know, hey, look, Taylor may end up telling me that this isn't a good idea. He'll never say that directly. He'll help me figure that out. But I know that my idea is going to get workshopped. We're going to brainstorm. We're going to spar over it. And a sparring match isn't a fight. A sparring match is how can two people get better and going at each other. And you're going to get a little bruises every once in a while and whatnot. But the intention is to make each other better. And I think that mindset combined with this idea of yes and started to help me avoid that trap more often than not. I'd be lying if I said that I never fall into it, but I don't fall into it nearly as much as I used to.
You mentioned growing up in audit, Ernst and Young, if I remember.
Yeah, that's correct.
How were those days? It was right after college?
That's right. Yeah. So I came into EY right after the Great Recession. So, it was a little bit, it was an interesting time for sure. The way that I was trained it is it was a really great experience in an industry that really wasn't for me. And I loved the variability of seeing different clients and seeing different things. And I loved the idea of, there are problems that need to be solved. The things that I didn't like was one, how constrained solutions were, right? Because again, GAAP has rules. So you have to do things in a certain way. And the creative side of me is always like, oh, but wouldn't it be fun if you could try a different way? Wouldn't it be like, but The second thing, though, was so much of the role, at least at the level that I was at, was calling out where the problems were. And you would just kind of throw it over the wall to the client and say, all right, well, here are all your issues. Bye. I'll see you in a couple of weeks or in a month or in a year or whatever. And I was like, man, I really want to see these things into the completion and actually solve problems. And so it was after a few years of doing that where I kind of realized I could probably be really good at this, but I will never really feel fulfilled. So I'd rather go do something that moves towards something that has a potential to make me feel fulfilled. And so I was like, well, I already have the accounting background. So if I go and work towards like maybe a finance FP&A type view, that seems to have the qualities that I want. I just kind of slowly worked my way over into that side of the house.
Interesting. One thing I must say that your creative side is very visible in your writings. From the post that we talked about, the Dr. No or Mr. No, to the one I found this one interesting, the FP&A storytelling one. That was also an interesting write. So was this visible to you when you were a kid that, hey, I'm a creative person, but somehow I straddle to finance?
Yeah, I would say when I ultimately was going towards accounting, a lot of my family and friends were like, really? So as a kid, like I always loved doing creative stuff. Like I did music, I did band and marching band, and I drew in my spare time. I always loved that stuff. And so when I originally went to college, I actually went for psychology because I just love the idea of like how people think and like and how many different ways your thinking can ultimately betray you, and like that sometimes it just takes someone to sit down with you and help you think through stuff to get to a different answer. And after a couple of years, I loved the material, but I saw like, oh, I don't know that this is the right thing for me because I'm either going to be, teaching all the time, which is fine, but I don't know that that's what I want to do. I don't know that I want to be a therapist because I think that would be kind of depressing. Like if I just was listening to people's problems all the time, I don't know that I could stand up to that. And quite frankly, I was like, oh, and then I also have to get like advanced degrees. I'm not sure that's going to be worth it. At the time, I was doing a business minor kind of as like my backup, and I went, well, okay, I can just flip this. I'm not too late in my career, so I'll go business major and I'll go psychology minor, and I'll only be a summer behind. And then I said, well, if I'm going to do business, I should probably specialize in something. And I had accounting professor, like just entry level accounting professor, saying, hey, look, accounting background, you can do anything in business if you understand how the financials work. And I said, all right, I'll specialize on accounting and I'll do that. And then just kind of suddenly started getting into it and going, oh yeah, this is I kind of like the math stuff, and there is some interesting pieces in the analytics, and there's some fun stuff there. So I'll just go down that path. And of course, then found out that in order to do accounting, you have to have an advanced degree. So I ended up violating one of my 3 principles of why I didn't do psychology. But that's kind of how I sort of just stumbled into it, and I think that's been a lot of my career is kind of stumbling into the next thing of having a feel for what I want to do, but I don't really know what I want to be when I grow up.
Very interesting. So ENY happens, and then GoDaddy happens, and then of course you are at Dashlane now. I'm curious how your transition happened from ENY to GoDaddy, which is deep into technology, software, domain registration, website hosting. What does it feel like?
Totally different world. So I technically had like a year stint in between at a real estate investment trust, and that's kind of how I first started getting my feet wet in FP&A. I was technically like a hybrid accounting finance role, and so it was good to get that background. But it just made me reaffirm like I don't really want to do accounting. I really want to do the finance side. So I don't want a half role. I want a whole. And so at the time, I was just kind of looking around, and I saw the opening at GoDaddy. GoDaddy was one of my clients back in my EY days, just for like a brief period earlier in my EY career. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I remember what they do, and it's a company that everybody knows. It sounds like it would be interesting. And to your point, it's tech, and there's not a lot of tech here in Arizona, so that would be really interesting to do. And the one downside is that I was a manager at this real estate investment trust, and the role that I was going for was a senior financial analyst. And I was like, you know what? I want to be on that ride, so I'll take the hit. I'll take a dip in title, I'll take a dip in pay. I don't care. I just want to be there. And that's kind of what I said in my interviews. Like, I just want to be here. I don't care what I do. And it just so happened that when I got there, my initial role was, kind of a traditional corporate FP&A analyst type, headcount, travel, et cetera. But about 3 months into the role, the customer care team had kind of come back to the VP of finance and said, hey, look, we're actually struggling to work with your finance team. They're telling us no a lot. They're not really partnering with us. All of those things that we just talked about. And they said, we would like to have some new blood in here. And so he came to me and said, hey, look, you're new here. You don't really have like an established role. Can you just fill in the gap here for a little bit while I figure out what to do? And then I never left. And I over time, I built up partnerships with a lot of different orgs in GoDaddy, but I always had customer care as one of my partners. And I just loved it. Like I just loved every aspect because, not only the tech piece, but sales and support specifically, it's humans interacting with other humans. It's so interesting because there's so many dynamics you have to take into account of if you say a dip in sales, is it because the customers are different? Is it because the salespeople are different? Is it some more macro thing? There's so many different variables to consider. And then on top of that, like it's just humans trying to help other humans use a product. And like there's just something really compelling about that mission of how do we help our people help our customers in the best way possible. And it just made me appreciate the human element overall, because when you're in that, what I'll say, corporate FP&A type role, it's all very spreadsheet numbers. Like how much did you travel? There's no story there. But when you're talking about how our people interact with customers, suddenly there's this rich story about what we're doing differently and how we could improve. And sometimes the improvement is just simply making the lives of our customer care agents better. And like you can see a huge impact because it's humans, and humans need motivation beyond just a paycheck and a spreadsheet that says they have to hit a certain number.
Very well said. I love that part. And it's just not those numbers, but what those stories out of those numbers. Absolutely agree.
That's right.
And then your transition happened from GoDaddy to Dashlane. How did that come about?
Yeah, so I was at GoDaddy for 8 years, and I loved it. I loved the company. I loved the people and the team that I had built. I had started as an individual contributor, and at the time, I think I had a team of like 14 people. So it was all really good, but I just kind of kept thinking, boy, am I just kind of in a mode right now where I'm just doing what I always know how to do? Like I don't like the challenges that come up, or it's almost like reruns. I've already seen this challenge before. And it sounds egotistical. I don't mean it to be. Like, it's not that I know what the answer is, but I know the approach. I know the steps that we have to go through. And I was like, if I want to be challenged and I want to keep growing and developing, I'm going to have to look somewhere else. And it just so happened that Dashlane reached out and said, hey, we're looking for someone to help us, really build out our FP&A function. We have some folks here, but we want to level up, specifically the partnership aspect, which, made my ears ring and say, okay, yeah, I like that part. And then I met our CFO, David Lapter, who's amazing, just a really charismatic, very empathetic leader. And I was like, yeah, this is a guy that I really could see learning a lot from, and met the rest of the exec team and thought they were great. And so got the offer, and I said, yeah, I don't know if I can do it, guys. Sorry. No, thank you. And then they came back and said, are you sure? And David, my CFO, sent an email, like just a beautiful email, just kind of laying out, look, I think this is the right place for you, and it's the right time. And you and I are going to be partners on this. And I just said, forget it. Okay, I'm going to do it. Let's go. And, I made the jump, and I got to admit, like it was scary. It's scary leaving a place that for 8 years, where everything, how to get the data, who to go to, the history, and then you come into a new place and it's all brand new. And not to mention remote, because Dashlane is based out of New York and Lisbon and Paris, and I'm here in Arizona, a world away. And so it was a lot of challenges all at once, but that's what I was looking for was, okay, can I rise up to a challenge? The thing I kept thinking about is there's a story about Stephen King when he was writing books and he was super successful. And he was like, man, am I successful because I'm Stephen King? Like, are all these books good because it has my name on it? And so he started writing under Richard Bachman to see if he could get books to the same level of success. And he did. And I don't want to argue that I'm anywhere near Stephen King levels, but this was kind of like my Richard Bachman moment of like, hey, can I go into a new place and achieve a similar level of success, or was it a function of situation? And record books will tell someday in the future. I have no idea whether or not, but it's been an amazing ride and a lot of learning. It's just a different world.
That's incredible. Coming out of the comfort zone. Hats off to you on that. 8 years, well-oiled machine, and you're running it, and then, hey, just leave everything behind.
When you hit that moment where it's like, I know that this is where my growth curve probably levels up and it's time to step off and do something else. Like, when that moment's there, you just need enough of a nudge to like feel good about just taking the chance. And, ultimately the thing that I kind of realized was like, there's no right answer ever. There's always like, there's degrees of good. But I take the risk, I take the jump, and the worst thing that happens is I have to do something else down the road. But the inverse of, like, if I look back and said that I was there for another few years doing the same thing, would I feel fulfilled? Back to what I was talking about with the accounting stuff and everything else. And I was like, no, I don't think I feel fulfilled anymore. Not that I don't care about the people or the company or the team, but personally, my own development, I just feel like I've, kind of hit probably more of a leveled off spot, and it's time for me to go and see if I can accelerate it again.
Love to know more about Dashlane. So we're gonna tell the audience, what does Dashlane do? Where is the company in its own journey? Any other sound bites you want to share about Dashlane?
Yeah, so Dashlane is in the password management, identity management space. We have over 18 million users on the consumer side. We have about 20,000 customers on the B2B side. And that's one of the really interesting aspects of the business. We started as a B2C company and saw a lot of success there, but kind of almost organically, you started to see companies seeing the same value in password management that customers do, which is you spend so much time building up these walls to protect all of your data and all of your information, but then there's still this rickety old gate of a password that is pretty easy to break into. And password management gives you a way to be able to protect yourself from that. It is a first line of defense. And so we've been around for a while, continuing to innovate and grow and develop in that space. And has some awesome investors behind us as well. We've got Bessemer, Sequoia, among others. So it's a really great company.
Super interesting. And what does your day look like? How big is your team? What do you do? Let's say you wake up at 8 a.m. Okay, this is my work to do.
Yeah, well, so I'm working New York hours, so I'm up way earlier than 8 a.m. But I think, like a lot of finance folks right now, there's not a consistent day to day, right? Like everything with post COVID, it's chaos every day, almost regardless of what size company that you're in. But from a team size perspective, I run our FP&A team and then also our business analytics team. Our FP&A team, there are 2 folks with a backfill that we're hopefully filling here pretty soon, so there's 3 total. And then on the business analytics side, there's 8 or 9, depending on like the backfill count there as well. And so really, the cadence that we have is on a weekly basis. I'm looking at the pacing of the top line of the business, seeing how things are going, reporting it out to the exec team in the company, kind of saying, here's the major callouts, here's how we're pacing against whatever our commitments were. And then, a lot of the rest of the week is actually starting to dive into those dynamics and figuring out what's going well, what's not going well. I'm sure that we're not alone in saying, like, it's hard to have any kind of a baseline over the last couple of years because COVID kind of ruined any seasonality curves, right? So normally from FP&A standpoint, you step back and you say, oh, okay, well, like normally August is a higher month because it's summer or whatever, and then it's going to go down. But then you look at the last 3 years and you see curves that are just erratic and jumping all over the place. So a lot of what we're doing is trying to dive deeper and figure out what are the trends that are meaningful and what are the trends that appear to be noise. And so the other thing that has really started to dominate my day and time has been how to better leverage and structure our data. In this environment, data and finance are becoming closer and closer together to the point where I think there's hardly any separation anymore. Certainly in tech businesses or businesses where you've got a lot of variability. And so we're investing time in thinking about what are new frameworks to look at how our existing customers operate. Is there new segmentation that we should apply? Is there new data structures that we need to pull together to be able to better understand what's going on or get sooner information? And that's really where I spend a lot of my time today, is guiding the company, guiding the exec team and my team around what's going on in the world, and then trying to start to build out the infrastructure that allows for us to be more agile, both in decision making and also in forecasting. Because like most teams, you start from a couple of years back where it's you got an annual budget, maybe you do at most a quarterly reforecast, and now everyone's doing a reforecast every few weeks. And most of our systems aren't built for that. And so you really have to start thinking about how do you keep up the agility without losing too much of the accuracy.
So if I compare your time now at Dashlane, early stage, venture funded, versus GoDaddy, I'm assuming it was public when you joined, or it went public during your time.
Public the year after I joined, correct. Yep.
Got it. So Has your role changed because of either onslaught of data or size of these two companies or stages that they are in?
I think the change has mostly come from the partially is the onslaught of data, right? Because as more data comes through, there's an appetite to leverage that data in decision making, and that decision making then needs to be paired with some kind of expectation, right? So the more distant our models or our forecasts are from the day-to-day decision making, the harder it is to reconcile those two things. Either how are we doing relative to those commitments, or even if those are commitments that we're willing to make. And I think there was a period of time where you could have a lot of space between those two things because the world was predictable. And you kind of saw like, all right, there's a general growth curve to this business. And certainly as a bigger business, you kind of see some of those things. But again, COVID broke a lot of that, where you saw customer demand skyrocket and then plummet, and there's all these things going on. So I think it's the combination of the availability of data, the types of data that businesses are capturing, but then it's also trying to build that into the decision-making frameworks of the folks on the ground so that they're leveraging the data that they look at day to day and be able to ladder up to what the financial outcomes are going to be.
Interesting. And do you see the demand curve changing again? And you mentioned, of course, COVID skyrocketed the demand for many of the tech products. And then, of course, we see a downhill. Is this seasonal, or this lukewarm behavior is going to persist?
Man, if I knew the answer, I think I would be in a very different position and probably a much bigger house. But I suspect that it feels like this is something that is going to be more temporary, right? Like if you just kind of read the normal like surveys of the populations, where it's like my own personal financial situation is okay, but I'm worried about the overall financial situation of the country or the world or whatever. And so it feels like there's a point where those two worlds start to reconcile, and where that regression happens or where that meeting in the minds occurs, I don't know. Is it as bad as everyone feels like, or is it as good as everyone's individual situation is? But I think that reconciliation eliminates the uncertainty, and then you start to see at least a more committed behavior where it's consistent and you can start to predict it. Whereas right now, month to month, week to week, you can see big swings, and it's hard to say like, was last week unusual or is this week unusual? Are they both? And I think as the dust settles at the end of this year, hopefully or in early next, you start to see that predictability start to come back. And then you start to be able to leverage what we're talking about, like baselines and prior year and seasonality. And I think that will help everyone start to feel more comfortable because there are other data points to leverage other than what most recently occurred.
Interesting. I'm going to go back to your mention about Stephen King. Do you read a lot?
I try to. I've got a almost 2-year-old at home, so that's eaten up a lot of my reading time. But every once in a while, I find a way. Yeah.
Got it. And any favorites you want to share with the audience?
I have a ton. So I actually I have a personal website just where I've kind of been storing some of my writings of tayloratstot.com, and I have some suggestions there. But the few that I typically recommend to people, depending on like where they're looking to grow or build. I love Creativity Inc., which was written by Ed Catmull of Pixar, in part because my wife is a huge Disney fan. So like by osmosis, I've become a big Disney fan. And so like I've come to appreciate a lot of stuff about that. But the story is not only about the creation of Pixar, but it's really a story about how to create a high performing organization. And like any high performing organization, it's fragile. Nothing lasts forever, but it did last a really long time of success after success. And it talks about what the elements would have been. And so there's some really good learnings of whether you're trying to think about how to instill creativity in your team, or how to make people feel psychologically safe, or even just how to overcome some challenges. There's just a lot of really great stuff in that one. And if you're looking more for kind of the strategic book, I think it's called Beyond the Hockey Stick, or Strategy Beyond the Hockey Stick, something like. But basically, the concept is look, almost every company has these budgets where in the fourth quarter you have this giant hockey stick where everything gets magically better, and this is not a function of a bad like planning, like forecasting model, but it's actually a bad structure about how budgets are built. And so it talks about the social dynamic of budgeting. and how people are actually incentivized to advocate for a lot early on and then promise for things down the road that they likely know intuitively they won't have to deliver. Not saying that anyone's doing it with ill intent, but the flip side is you don't ask for anything and then you're still going to get on the hook for some commitment. So it talks about those social dynamics and then talks about how to approach them with a process that is better run to avoid those hockey sticks that are impossible to catch up to. So I found that one super interesting. And then the final one that I usually recommend to everyone is the classic of high output management, of just managing a team. Managing is hard, especially in a remote environment, and appreciating the dynamics. Like that, the art and science of management doesn't change very often. There's flavors to it, but like the core crux of it is in that book.
All three are great books. I have not read the second one. I've read Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull, read Andy Grove's High Output Management, and I think both of them are Bibles of building a high performance organization.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thanks for sharing those two books. As we wrap up our conversation today, Taylor, one question I ask all my guests is, any person or anybody who had a great influence as a career is shaped, do you have someone, do you have a mentor, or you had a mentor?
I've been so fortunate to have a lot. And so if I had to pick one, I think it would be really tough. The one that stands out to me is I had the same boss at GoDaddy for 8 years. Mike Pawney, who is our VP of Finance, Division CFO. And the couple of things that he really taught me beyond just the general of like how to do a good job was, one, really helped me lean into that partnership aspect. I still remember him sitting me down and being like, you just need to assume positive intent when you're working with these folks, right? Like, it's so easy to fall into the trap of thinking that people are against you or they're trying to, do something negative. And just having this approach of coming in of everyone's trying to do a good job and everyone's trying to do right. Like that mindset changes a lot. But he also just really taught me how to be yourself in a leadership role. And that's really hard to do, especially when you're leading a big team. You kind of almost want to play into a stereotype of what a leader looks like. But folks notice that that's not super genuine. When you can actually just be yourself, but also happen to be managing a team or also happen to be a leader, it really starts to appeal to everyone. And I feel like you can bring more folks along. I could probably list off like 30 other people who have helped me in my career, and that would just be scratching the surface. But, that's the first one that comes to mind.
You've been super lucky.
Very, very fortunate.
We'll definitely give him a shout out. Thank you for sharing that. As we wrap up this conversation, where can people find you?
Yeah, so a few places you can find me on LinkedIn. I am there a lot. And so you can also find me on my Substack that you mentioned. It's just tots.substack.com. Or you can find all of those links and some of the stuff that I've talked about on my website of tayloratstot.com. Any of those things, you'll find me, and feel free to send me a message.
Super. Thank you, Taylor. Thanks for coming on the show and sharing your insights. It was great having you.
It was my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
That's Taylor Otstot, our guest today. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Chief Future Officer Podcast. The Chief Future Officer Podcast is brought to you by Quolum, a CFO's best buddy to buy and manage SaaS. To support this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe to us on your preferred podcast application. Links to previous episodes and the rest of the show notes are in the bio, and I'd love to have you check out other episodes. Lastly, if you want to be on this podcast or recommend a friend, let us know in the comments below. Thank you.